guys, welcome back to another episode of the Red Line Talk Show. Today, we're honored to have with us Richard Lukaj, a leading figure in the world of investment banking. Richard is the managing partner of Bank Street Group, an investment bank he co-founded that specializes in technology, media, and telecommunications. Richard, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. We're excited to dive into your journey in finance and the insight that you've gained along the way. Welcome, and thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for having me. Absolutely delighted to be here.
So first, we want to learn a little bit about your background. Where you're coming from? How old were you when you came to this country? Were you born here, or were you born? I have no idea where you were born.
So, I was born in actually a refugee camp in Italy.
No way.
My parents left in sequence. My father actually left first to go and essentially try to provide for his family, and he left and settled in Italy for a number of years. And
We're in Rome?
No, we settled in a place called Capua, which was just outside of Naples.
Wow, that's
At the
interesting.
time, it was a well-known refugee camp in Italy, and sometime later, my mother joined them there to also help and also to be with her husband. And as I often like to joke, in the absence of internet or cable TV, there was a child.
There you go.
So I was born there. We lived there for some time, and in those days, these refugee camps would be offered opportunities, or I should say the residents of these refugee camps would be offered opportunities to go to places seeking labor. And at that time, America and Australia were the two that were seeking labor most aggressively in Italy. And my parents were offered the opportunity to consider either option. And
it shows America.
Well, they first said, okay, those are the A's. What about the B? Because I think they were hoping for something in Europe.
Yeah.
But eventually they conceded that they would go to the U.S., largely because it was closer.
Right.
And as you might imagine, they didn't have really any perspective on America. In fact, the only thing they knew about America was cowboys and Indian movies. And they said it's a terrible, terrible place we're going to.
What year was this?
So this was probably the early 70s at this point.
Okay.
Well, the early 70s when they arrived here. But I was born in 69, so that period of time was when they were considering what other options there could be, including, by the way, going back home.
Now, home is what part of Albania?
So that's a bit of a story, too. I often tell my kids I feel like we don't have any place that wants us. But my grandfather, well, our family lineage goes to the village of Lukaj in northern Albania.
Right.
And my grandfather was part of the Albanian government before the communists took over. So when the communists took over, he was a marked man. He was essentially a top listed person for persecution or death. And so he scurried over the border, and he actually moved into a village literally on the border between Albania and Montenegro, and expecting that before long, in fact, his immortal words in our household is that Albanians would never tolerate communism. We're too free. We want too much to be liberated, and as a result, there's no chance it would last. And who knew how wrong he would be?
That's a long time.
So he lived on that border village for 50 some odd years before the border opened, and unfortunately, he died 1 year before the border actually did open. And he used to always say two famous phrases from him were. Lash Tiranen and Mora Sultanen, which is his wife, and his other one was that he always dreamed to go back to the Cafe Male or the Grand Cafe in Shkodër, and unfortunately didn't have the opportunity to do that. And now actually the Grand Cafe has also been demolished, so it was a doubly emotional moment when I heard that as well.
So you don't have a city that you can refer back to saying I'm from this part of Albania. You kind of just say northern part.
My father and my mother grew up a village apart from each other, and if you've been between Albania and Montenegro, the village of Sukobin is right on the border with Albania on the Montenegrin side, and Muriçan is
that
on
the Shkodër region, or?
It's just as you leave Shkodër to go into Montenegro.
Right.
The two villages that adjoin each other is Muriçan and Sukobin. Sukobin is on Montenegro's side, and Muriçan is on the other. Many of my cousins are right in that area.
Got it. So you came here, you were born to, well, how old were you when you came here?
Quite young. I was maybe less than 2.
Ah, okay. So you kind of grew up here. So, okay.
I definitely grew up here. Or
And
I
you
grew up all
where,
over the world.
where in the specific in New York area, or was it Connecticut, or?
So no. So I like many in that time, the Albanian immigrants were shuttled in alongside all of the Eastern European immigrants, and the pathway was always to the Lower East Side of Manhattan. That was kind of the place where almost everybody started. The Lower East Side of Manhattan for my parents was hell. I mean, they said this is the worst place we've ever imagined.
Especially at that time in the 70s.
Well, it was violent. It was full of crime. It was the heroin capital of the world at the time. It was rampant drug use, prostitution. Every crime you could think of was in full motion there.
Yeah, that's how my father and my grandfather described it.
Yeah, and so my mother, in survival mode, would actually take me in her arms at night, because my dad worked at night, and go meet him by the train station, thinking that people will not mug a family with a child. So they would do that as a routine. And eventually they thankfully saved enough money to move into another neighborhood, which wasn't candidly that much better, but it was safer. They did that as quickly as they could, because they saw all kinds of things they never thought they wanted to see. So tough place to raise a child. Academically, let me maybe step even further back and say most of the places where we lived as kids were horror. I mean, there was terror every day. People get stabbed and terrible crimes happening all around us. Rarely made the news because no one really cared. We were like living a life of folks that didn't matter. And it was a very weird way to go through life. For us as children, I remember 2 kind of distinct emotions, which is a weird thing to juxtapose sometimes. But one is, I remember being afraid almost all the time. And I also remember being happy almost all the time. It's kind of a weird pairing to think about. Our external world was pretty terrifying. There were all kinds of rival gangs. There was all kinds of crime activity that was juxtaposing on each other. But despite all of that, we somehow were trying to keep our head down and move our lives forward.
Did that motivate you to do better in life, that lifestyle? Did it make
at
you
that
tougher?
age, it was too much survival mode to say that it was already programming in some other way or transitioning into some other way. It was more about survival than it was about any program. I couldn't tell you that at that time I was thinking ambition. I was thinking survival.
Right.
I was glad when I got to school and got through a day at school and was able to make it home without anything happening. So over time, what I did realize is my academic work was always opening something new for me. And I was always willing to work hard. I was willing to do whatever was asked of me. I was pretty dutiful as a son. But nothing really opened my eyes to things like education did. And so I found either a love for it or I became addicted to it because it kept showing me freedoms. Like every time I learned something new, it seemed to open another door or another window to something new. And so I became a pretty dedicated student. And I wouldn't tell you it was because of any externality or something that pushed it, other than it was a combination of curiosity, and over time it also became a bit of this adventure I was kind of on, trying to figure out where this world takes me as an individual, not as part of a collective per se, while at the same time being dutiful and responsible and trying to be useful to my family environment as well. And so that led to very good experience in elementary school. I was the valedictorian in my middle school. I was a top 10 student at my high school, which was Brooklyn Tech, not far from where
nice.
we're sitting. And, afforded me the ability to consider top schools because top schools were actually willing to help me finance going to these top schools, which we couldn't do otherwise.
Right.
So every thing that was invested in the sort of academic route was sort of allowing me to escape silos of imprisonment that I saw it as otherwise, because there was no other obvious pathway.
You were living in fear, like you said, most of the time.
Yeah, and the role models weren't particularly good. So there
Right.
wasn't like there was a lot of obvious examples of people who would show you that here's another pathway to success. And it was the only one that still was uncertain because nobody said, hey, if you do really well in school, you're going to succeed. Occasionally, my parents would make phrases like that, like it could open up possibilities, but it was not something they knew about. My parents, unfortunately, due to discrimination in former Yugoslavia, were both denied education. So as a result of that, they both had elementary school educations, and they always had a lust for their children to have an education,
Right.
albeit not knowing what it means or what it could be used for. Just that as part of their wish for coming here, it was to afford their children the ability to have a proper education.
And the hope that the education would bring their children to another level, another opportunities.
It was less about level; it was more about belonging and fitting in,
That makes sense.
and not being a foreigner. So in the early years, I remember a lot of energy being spent on trying to fit in, trying to look and be like everyone else. It wasn't about distinguishing yourself or achieving higher highs. It was about, settling into a place of comfort because they had never known comfort as adults, and they wanted that for their children. And it wasn't about, magnificent achievement. It was about basic necessities in some respects. And as long as those were satisfied, they were happy. For an ambitious teenager, there were times when I would debate with particularly my father about this topic, and he would talk to me about what it means to have enough and what it means to find a balance rather than, raw or rampant ambition, and how rampant ambition can be toxic, not just
Right.
not just
Yeah.
a positive. And
Did
so
you listen to that advice, or
it's funny, like most young people, those lessons in life sort of resonate later. And as you get to a
When you
place
think
where
back, you're like, oh,
some of it, sounds like wisdom, and wisdom is achieved with time. And
That is
some
true.
of it also is contextual, right? So the life I was living at the time didn't relate to my father. Even though I'd lived in that camp, I was too young to remember much of that. And even though the volatility in their lives had been so extreme, in my world it didn't seem so. They largely immunized me from knowing how volatile their life was. I was fortunate to never know that my parents, most of their lives, were a paycheck or two from homelessness.
so who were your role models then growing up? Like, how did you find this path that you're going through?
So I would say I was very fortunate to have a few inspirational teachers because I didn't have it anywhere else. I mean, I had good role models in terms of character and moral values and things of that sort. And even there, there were occasional
Disappointments?
recognition that, disappointments is one of them, recognition that people are fallible.
Right.
And part of learning that, particularly in those environments, people are more fallible than they even mean to be sometimes. But that's a longer story and a long digression. But the point I'm making is that to the role model elements, I had these teachers that dared me to drag my attention away from all the periphery and into something. And I remember in middle school, I found this deep love, largely due to the principal of my school, for history and understanding how humanity and civilization and society evolve. And I became very interested in the subject of how these intertwining elements have led to success and failure in societies, and where the human factor has a role in all of that. And I found it such a interesting subject, I think, because it largely was helping me to try to understand how families are displaced and how people's opportunities are swept away, and how bad leadership in government can really affect societies, and so many other layers. And in high school, actually, I became much more obsessed with technical things. Like I remember how obsessed I was about physics and mathematics and things that were absolute, because I had found interest in I'll call it the soft educational elements, but I also wanted to test the limits on the hard analytics. And I became very obsessed about that and testing the limits. And I was very fortunate to, in every part of my public education, and I stress the public, which means the public schools in the city were able to afford people the ability to break through even the standards, because I graduated high school with almost my college education completed.
Oh, wow.
And so while I was in college, I was able to almost finish my master's degree while I was just an undergrad.
So what did you study in college? Was it
So
finance?
I left Brooklyn Tech, which was a very technical school, wanting to be an engineer. And while I was there, I actually received most of my credits to an associate's degree in engineering. And about the time I was graduating from high school with all of those advanced credits towards engineering, I decided to switch to business, or to finance and economics and other related topics. And I actually felt at the time, and in hindsight, it seemed to line up, but I felt the balance of engineering, technology-centric DNA, married with a business perspective, was a pretty good marriage for what's to come. And I left college with most of my master's degree, or most of my MBA completed, and interviewed on Wall Street, which was a foreign place to me.
Right.
Wall Street, I knew, as the places where my relatives used to clean the buildings.
Right.
So I remember the buildings. I didn't know what actually happened in them.
Were you like from the Albanian community? Were you connected to the Albanian community at that time in your field? Were there other Albanians working with you in that time, or not really?
I was always connected to our community, as defined by family and circle of friends and neighbors and so forth. And but obviously we had lots of other friends and neighbors as well. As it relates to Albanians on Wall Street at the time, it was practically non-existent.
Right.
And every blue moon, we'd come across one of us. We'd find each other, and it'd be like an amazing thing. Like I remember the first time I met Femi Zeko. I was like, Femi Zeko, you must be Albanian. And sure enough, he was. And there was another fellow at Lehman Brothers, and another guy, senior guy at Morgan Stanley. And
So it was a handful of you guys at that time.
And we had almost no crossing paths, really. Right. Femi actually, although did come to my firm, and we were partners at the same firm for a period of time, but that was very extremely rare. Whereas now, I still spend some time interacting with young people who are considering careers and so forth, and I get the opportunity to speak at schools. And I remember when I was at NYU, the number of Albanians at the school were, you can count on a hand, a single hand. And I was invited to speak to the business school. I think it was a panel discussion about the finance industry and employment opportunities within it. And it was hosted by the Albanian Student Organization. And I remember 35, 40 kids just from the business school showing up. And I'm like,
yeah, that's a lot now.
So that must make you feel so great that you know that you are one of the role models for a lot of people
in the finance world.
In the finance world,
that's a heavy burden, but
but you are.
Yeah, I think now thankfully we have many good role models in the community who are successful across so many subsectors of finance, and I'm delighted to be among them. But I count many friends now who are Albanian and who have succeeded in wide varieties of spheres in this category. And candidly, I feel like it's just starting, because I feel like there's a generation of ambitious, maybe better prepared, maybe also the pathway to success, which comes in some cases from opportunities to have exposure and opportunities to intern and opportunities to have a familiarity with the category, is quite different today. I mean, I think there's so many Albanian community organizations and student organizations that now just afford people a different perspective. I mean, there were no Albanian entrepreneurial or professional studies groups of any kind when I was growing up. There was no such thing. And if there wasn't, I didn't know where it was. And I didn't have any familiarity. I mean, Wall Street was a pretty closed community in those days. And generally speaking, to be employed there, you had to know somebody, because they didn't come to you unless you were somehow very visible to them. And even my first job on Wall Street was a bit of an accident. I was a bit of an unusual kid, probably, maybe at times a bit too self-assured. But I remember my resume had been selected by one of the recruiters at Goldman Sachs at the time. And during the interview, she asked me if I could tell her why it is. I'll never forget the question because it staggered me. So why it is that the sewer cover doesn't fall through if the inside and the outside are both circles. And I looked at her.
What?
Well, it was,
I'm
I guess,
curious
some
to
kind
see
of
how
an
you answered
IQ
that.
test. And I said, did you happen to look at my resume before this meeting? And she said, yes, I did. I said, did you notice some advanced math and maybe geometry would have been part of that? And I said, this question seems very odd, related to who I am, and I think what you're looking for. But can you explain to me what prompts the question? And she said, well, no one's ever asked me that before. And I said, okay, we're both on the same place. And then she said, well, we have a series of standard questions, and we apply them to everybody. It's the same questions for everyone. And I said, well, does that say anything about what you're looking for in the role? Because if you're looking for the same person basically in the role, that's probably not a place I feel like I want to be. And she says, well, at the entry level, it is a bit about fitting into a particular sphere of activity, and we don't really look for people to deviate too much from that. And I said, well, thank you, but it's probably not the place for me. And she said, well, no one's ever told me as a recruiter for Goldman Sachs that they're not interested in Goldman Sachs. It's the first time I've ever heard that.
So naturally they wanted you.
I said, well, maybe someday I might be interested, but, I view this next chapter of my life, much like probably most college grads today, as an uncertain one. I'm not really sure where I'm going. I'm graduating from college. I've done well educationally. I've worked really hard. I actually worked full-time while I was going through college to pay for college. So I'm not 100% sure where my road is going. And large part of the reason I want to go into investment banking or consulting or one of these firms that gives me a peer into so many other companies is so I can actually see so many other companies, because I want to see more. And my hope is that I'll grow up while I'm seeing these companies and maybe go to one of those companies and be a grown-up. Little did I know that I'd actually love the idea of working with different companies, different innovators, and people working on a transaction at the most pivotal milestones for these companies in their evolution. And I became pretty addicted to that. And I loved what I was doing, and I loved that I was able to be an impact player for these companies. But the other attribute that I think, I probably interviewed 187 or more companies during my high school, my last year in college. And I remember doing it voraciously because I didn't want to make a mistake. I really just wanted to end up somewhere where I'd be able to turn on my maximum energy and feel like I'm doing it for something worthwhile. And for me, that meant no barriers. It meant like, let me really see what I'm capable of. And I wanted to do that more than anything. And I would have done it in almost any firm that would let me do it. And then I came across this firm, Bear Stearns, who was completely accidental. I wasn't selected in their interview cycle, but it just so happened to be that I was at the career office checking on an appointment for a different interview, and the woman who ran the resume and career planning place said to me, "Hey, there was just an interview that was canceled. Would you want to substitute in?"
Wow.
And I said, "With who?" They said, "Bear Stearns." I'm like, "What's Bear Stearns?" I have no idea. And she said, "Well, it's another securities firm, another investment banking practice, and this is within their investment banking group."
Talk about divine intervention at that moment.
And as luck would have it, I sat down and I had arguably the finest interview I'd had of any company I'd met before. And I remember the interviewer talking about meritocracy, an environment where they're looking for hungry people, an environment where you'll be supported but also allowed to run short of hanging yourself. And I said, "This sounds like a dream. This sounds like a dream come true." And I interviewed. They brought me back to the firm, had me interview with 7 more people. Apparently all the people said, "Yes, hire." They brought me back again, meet 7 or 8 more people. I had another full day of interviews. Again, I checked all the boxes. I went in for another time, and I'm like, what is happening here? How many people do I have to meet? And again, apparently I checked all the boxes, and then they leveled with me. What ended up happening was they actually had given out more job offers than they had to fill, and they did not expect that everybody would accept them. And so I was without a place. They kept bringing me in for interviews because they were hoping that I'd fall down one day, but they kept saying, "This guy, everybody says that he belongs here."
Yeah.
And I was lucky enough that one of the people who interviewed me said, "We should just make a place for him. He's a good fit. He's the kind of person that really belongs here." And he was right.
A lot of people forget that when, especially right out of college, and they're starting the interview process, a lot of times people get nervous because they think that the job is interviewing them to hire. But people forget that you are also interviewing
That's right.
the location, the
company.
job, the culture, opportunities for growth, and can you speak to us a little bit about that and making sure that when you interview for a job, what you're looking for specifically?
When you hire.
So it depends on the level, and obviously it depends on the person, and what you're solving for, and in different generations. And this is often a topic of debate between parents and children, because what a parent might have been aspiring for in a job might have been a very different filter. Like, even my approach to interviewing was considered strange or almost arrogant. Like, how do you think it matters what you think? You're just trying to get a job, right? My parents would be like, "Why are you asking questions? You're trying to get a job." And I was like, "I'm not just trying to get a job. I have a lot to offer. And I need to actually be at a place where I have a shot at what I have to offer, having a shot at being its best." And that was a very foreign concept to that generation. And I think in terms of young people who are looking for employment opportunities, number one is, don't be afraid. Like, just cross the chasm. It's uncomfortable crossing the line. And you might embarrass yourself at the first interview. You might embarrass yourself at the second one. You might not be a great fit for the third or fourth or fifth one. As I said, I took 187 interviews. I got 5 offers. And of the 5 offers, the distance or difference between them was all over the map. And so ultimately, I did find the one opportunity that opened up a lot of additional doors for me as well. But in some ways, my path was also oriented around that same academic path, which is I wanted to go somewhere where I'd be afforded the ability to learn the most. And there were no guardrails. There was no opportunity to be limited. And I remember, when I first arrived at Bear Stearns, they would say things like, "Look, we don't take junior people to meetings unless you have nothing to do. So the only way to have nothing to do is you have to be up all night finishing all the work you have to be done, so that you're sitting there saying, I'm available, I can go to the meeting. And I always wanted to go to the meeting because I wanted to see how my work is affecting the broader process. And so being disciplined enough to ask yourself, what am I capable of? What am I willing to do? A lot of folks would say, no, I'm not doing that. I'll just do my work and play by the game. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's no judgment issue on any side of that. They're just different people. And so when you ask me the question, what am I looking for? I'm looking for somebody who's extraordinary. That doesn't mean they're like me. In fact, if you looked at our team, it's a very diverse team with a lot of different experiences, a lot of different perspectives. Some are crazy, hungry, and ambitious. Some are much more level-headed and balanced. Some are, we have every walk of life. We have every religion, every kind of
background.
person. I would say the one area that we don't have enough of throughout Wall Street is women. And this is the generation where I think women will have the opportunity of a lifetime. And it will seem also to the average woman daunting when you look at a society on Wall Street that is still heavily male-dominated. But that's the opportunity, because in a tie, a woman wins today. And so this is, there's no one on Wall Street who's going to hire someone just for filling a role. And that's why it still is the way it is. But
why do you think that? Like, why do you think the time is for a woman? What are the quality differences?
Well, I think it is a different environment. I think, for example, why did I make a big deal out of the diversity in our firm? I used to have a few more senior women at the firm that moved on to other things in their lives, but replacing them with more women has been very difficult. Like we represent a job offering, and we may get 10,000 resumes, but the number of women that apply is very small. And the number of those that did apply that are actually qualified is even smaller. And then the ones that we actually like are bid away because there's so few of them that every firm on the street wants them. So if you are capable and you do like the industry and you're prepared to make the sacrifices to succeed in the industry, there's never been a better time. It's very receptive for a woman to enter the sphere, certainly more so than anything we've seen in prior generations.
So I want to talk a little bit about the firm that you mentioned, right? So you have 25 years of investment banking experience, and you co-founded the Bank Street Group. Walk us through that journey and what made you decide to open up an investment bank. And I think you're probably one of the first Albanians to open up an investment bank
that we know of.
That we know of.
If you know of any, I don't know of another one yet.
There you go.
But I'm sure that won't be the case forever. But so there's a bunch of interweaving there. So I had a dream experience at Bear Stearns. I grew up there. I did everything that I could physically and mentally handle, and I had experiences that people dream about. I mean, I led a life where I was upset to go to sleep because it was such a good day that it's a shame to go to sleep now.
The day is over.
And I couldn't wait for the next day. And I remember actually when I was getting my first bonus review cycle, and they told me the number, and I didn't seem to even be interested in it. And I left the room real quick, and they were like, "What are you doing? What happened?" And I'm like, "I'm sorry, what did I miss? I thought you gave me the number. What else is there?" And they're like, "Well, are you okay with it? Are you leaving? What's happening?" I'm like, "If you didn't pay me anything, I'd be back here tomorrow." I'm just having the time of my life.
So you're really passionate, huh?
I was really blessed, or I felt blessed as well, that I was having opportunity to do things that I never dreamed I'd do in my lifetime, let alone doing them at the age and opportunity set that I was finding myself in. I was in boardrooms in my early 20s, contributing to impactful discussion, and going on business trips where investors were trusting me to make a judgment call on whether or not that investment was a worthwhile endeavor or not. I was being entrusted by companies to help them raise money that could have meant life or death for the business. So many layers of that made me made me happy, content, satisfied, tired a lot, but because I was burning a lot of hours. I mean, I averaged sometimes easily 100-hour plus weeks, and again, it's not for everybody, but for me, it was a very satisfying time. Now, the downside of all of that is there are trade-offs, right? In that, let's call it roughly 10-year period, I really became pretty disconnected from everything. I became really good at what I was doing professionally, but I had lost much else in my life. I didn't have the same connection with my siblings that I used to have because I saw them so less frequently. I had missed a lot of things, a lot of holidays, a lot of anniversaries, a lot of moments with my parents. That has a cost. And you wake up one day and you're like, what am I doing?
Yeah.
Like, and life has its fateful moments, right? Just as you were describing how the sequence of events when they connect, things happen, right? And it was around that time that I encountered my wife, and my now wife. At the time, she was a newbie in New York. She was at Fordham Grad School, just moved here to go there, and from Connecticut. She and I met, and it was a moment in time when I wanted something more in my life. I didn't know what it was, didn't really have an appreciation for it. It's interesting because at that moment, all of those things line up, right? I started realizing that I had done so well in my professional life. I was now a senior partner of the firm, the youngest ever in the firm's history at that time, only to be beaten by my now partner at my current firm.
How old were you?
I was 27, I think.
Wow. Senior partner in 27?
Yes.
That's amazing.
So you go through a little high from all of that. Magazine covers. My dad was in a subway one day and he saw this magazine and that's my son. Never saw that before. So anyway, those highs pass, and then you realize, okay, well, what happens from now till the end of my career? It feels like now I'm a hamster on a wheel. Like this is mostly or much more administrative, a lot more internal wrangling than it is about growth and opportunity and learning. And not to say that there was no learning going on at that level, but it was not the same trajectory that I had become so used to in large measure. So I ended up, as things happened quickly, becoming partner. I was engaged, then married shortly thereafter. We had a child shortly thereafter. Not much of it planned, candidly. A lot of it just kind of falls into place because the moment seems right.
The doors were opening.
And I remember actually my daughter Zana had been born, and I think I went on a road show, and it was one of these longer road shows, and I think I'd been in cities all over the U.S., Europe, Asia, and I think I'd come back like 2 or 3 weeks later. And I remember coming home and looking at Zana, and she was like almost double the size she was when I left her. And I remember thinking to myself how I had told myself in my early 20s when I was working these 100-hour work weeks that this is exactly what I don't want someday when I have family and other obligations. And it was all sort of compounding with the fact that also I already felt like at this stage in my life, I wanted to have more control in my life. And I wasn't really sure how to have that or how to get that, and especially in the business that I was in, where it's expected that if you have a client, that has a demand or an issue, everything must drop.
Yeah.
That is the only thing that, if you want to stay in that business, because competitively you will.
Oh, you will lose the client.
You will lose the client, and you will lose the reputation of being that
Right.
available resource. So I, started to reconcile with those thoughts and emotions. There's a lot that goes into those times, and after about 2 or 3 years, and a lot of other compounding factors, but I decided to leave my old firm, and I didn't really have a plan. I felt blessed at the time because I'd saved. I didn't have much of a life most of my young years, so I basically saved almost everything I made, and so I felt safe financially, but I was walking into the abyss and uncertain about what's next because I didn't have any role models or anybody to talk to about it. Like, what do you do after you have an incredibly successful career that ends in less than 10 years? It's
Right.
like, what just happened? But it felt like it needed to end for me, at least there. I didn't really know where I was going to go next or do what I was going to do next. But as fate has it, my wife was then again pregnant with our second children. As it turns out, they were identical twins at the time.
Oh.
Oh, wow.
But it was a traumatic pregnancy, and so we ended up losing one of our two daughters. And
Oh, man.
during that period of time in which we were dealing with the difficult pregnancy and the related aftermath, it was another compounding of variables that I would say, thankfully, I wasn't working because I don't think I would have functioned properly or normally during that time.
I still think there's divine intervention here too about the timelines.
Maybe. And I believe in such things because I do feel fortunate and blessed in many ways. But that caused me to actually go through new emotions that I had never felt before. Like I had felt most of my life invincible, immortal, words that young people say and feel maybe because you don't think about mortality at all in
Right.
your
And there's
youth.
some things that are just going to be out of your control.
And I rarely felt out of control. I felt generally like most things I could see them coming. I know what to do. I know how to act. I can plan for it. I can solve it. I can muscle up all kinds of resources and energy to deal with a problem. And here was a problem that, we had two sick babies in my wife's stomach that we couldn't solve. Modern science didn't have a solve for that. And so we found, obviously, the most exotic doctors, and she had the best treatment available on earth. But even that, they were born early. One of them was born, a pound and 6 or 8 ounces, and the other one was born half that.
Wow.
And so very premature. And thankfully, we had a mixed blessing, and one of them survived. The other one, unfortunately, survived for only 7 days. And my wife and I had the horror of watching our baby die in our arms. And I had never known such a thing. Also, it makes no sense for a parent to lose a child. It's not even conceivable. I also felt like it was the biggest failure in my life. And it was outside of my control. Something I'd never known before. So you go through your days, and you go through these cycles of emotions, and in the early innings, it's all anger because none of it makes sense,
Right.
and it's not right. But in time, you settle in and you start to accept. And in time, I also determined that I needed to find a way to re-engage again. The world.
Find a balance.
That was
for-
too hard to imagine still, but
Right.
just to disconnect from what I was absorbed by, and so I started basically accepting anything to do something. Go to places, go to conferences. I went to think tank events. I'd go to anything just to get my mind on something else. And I finally took an office not too far from where I live, and just to have a place to think about the next chapter of my life because I did want to do something else.
How old were you at this time?
Early 30s. So anyway, as luck would have it, as I started talking to people, I started meeting up with folks. I came across some folks that wanted to work with me on something or invited me to boards of things and invested in various companies and started getting re-engaged. And finally I said, I still love this. And I didn't love doing it where I was at that time anymore, but I still love this type of engagement. And so I started to formalize a bit, and I started to also go out and meet and talk to more people. That started leading to some more assignments. Like we got some work to do for Bell South at the time, if you remember that company, and then later AT&T and some other folks, and it felt like, hey, this could be a business. I don't know where it goes and how it shapes or how it evolves or how to even define it yet, but it could be gainful. And then I ran into one of my old partners from Bear Stearns who broke my record as the youngest senior partner. And he and I were brainstorming and said, you know what, we could make a run at this for a while and just see where it takes us.
Yeah.
And fast forward to today, in the last 6 months, we did 30 some odd $1 billion of transactions. And
Wow.
not a lot of people would think it's possible to go from a couple of guys, scratching their heads, thinking big thoughts, and to now being, a leading industry player in the stuff that we do, competing with everybody.
What would you say was your biggest emotion at that point of just trying to, should you open up your own company or not? Did you have fear at that point or excitement?
I'd say there was more fear in my family and circle of friends because I remember my brother saying he thought I needed an intervention. He said, something's wrong with you. People kill for the chair you're in. Why? What's happening?
Yeah.
But
Right.
it doesn't make sense. And why would you leave, a senior Wall Street job? People die to get there because it's an annuity. These firms are around forever and you're going to do just fine. Fast forward to today, my old firm has disappeared. And our current firm is actually thriving. And so life is not that clear and things are not that predictable or reliable. And the beauty of life is actually to make sure that you don't let too many days go by, not appreciating what they are. And if I had to do my life all over again, I don't think I would be as extreme in the things that I was doing at the times I was doing them, because I let too much time pass, and I lost too much. And even though I've become fabulously wealthy compared to anything I ever dreamed of, it doesn't compensate enough for what I feel I lost. And I think that's something that's hard to explain to people, but I'd give it all away if I could get some things that I lost back.
Wow. I do want to talk a little bit about the Albanian community.
Sure.
And your role in that, because you definitely played a role in that.
An instrumental role.
Yes. Specifically talking about NAC, right? I think you were vice chairman of NAC.
No, I was the chairman for many years.
Perfect. The chairman.
But I also was an accidental arrival to NAC. So I described to you what my professional life was like, and so I was probably in my late 20s, is my guess, when I started feeling the need to give back, because I felt like I'd been blessed, and I felt like I could have an impact in various circles. So NAC was not my first engagement, actually. I got involved with something called the Albanian Relief Fund first. And the Albanian Relief Fund was actually formed to help mainly refugees that fled when the communism fell in Albania. And so a lot of folks were displaced, and a lot of folks were looking to find their bearings, and things were pretty desperate in Albania at the time. And so that was my first foray, and it was very enjoyable for me because it was the first time actually coming across, in many respects, like-minded Albanians. These were generally professionals. Some of my still current friends go back to that era. One was an auditor, one was the president of a Slovenian bank, the other one was a real estate professional here in Manhattan. So it was a variety of people who look and felt like me, but were married to the idea of trying to make a difference. And I think that was the beginning of something that felt very satisfying as well. So I didn't want to stop. And when the crises started happening in Kosovo and other places, I got involved with almost an offspring similar program called the Kosovo Relief Fund. We all probably at that time were watching the images on television of the horrors that were happening under the, let's call it the Milosevic regime. And we all felt a calling to do something.
This was in the late 80s?
Late 90s.
Late 90s.
Yeah. So the Kosovo War was in late 90s. And my activity probably started a little bit before that in other areas and other activities. And I didn't have that much time. I had probably more money than time, so I was giving money away more easily than I had time to give. When the Kosovo War happened, that changed. I was willing to give much more time because in many ways the Kosovo War opened up something else, which is this could have been us. And there weren't a lot of me or people like me available at a moment in time to, let's call it, advocate for what's right. And in a society that doesn't know where Albania is. As we were joking earlier, we're a relatively unfamiliar people. Even though we were living among everyone in every major city in this country, it was still a relatively unfamiliar part of the world. And what was happening in former Yugoslavia was equally unfamiliar to people, although it became a battle for right and wrong. It became a battle for humanity. So I felt a calling to get involved, and I went looking, in fact, for which organization in the community could I join to become useful. And I looked at and went to meetings of various organizations, and I found most of the community organizations were talking to themselves. And I don't mean that in a bad way. It was important for them as part of a community. Right. And by the way,
it had its place.
It had its place, and also in many cases, it's what they knew. But I felt, right or wrong, at the time that what was most desperately needed is an outward-facing organization from our community to the rest of the world, and most notably to Washington, because I felt, as did others, that our saving grace was going to be if we could get Western interest in the matter, educate them, engage them there. It would save lives. We weren't sure how exactly things would unfold, but it was a important mission to take on. And so I went from working 100 hours a week on business matters to spending a considerable portion of that energy traveling to Washington, meeting with people, hosting dinners, writing everything I could write on the subject, engaging with people back home to get content and materials and elements that would be helpful to greater causes, and leading at the time, and let me get to how I found NAC. So shortly before I discovered them, they had formed this organization called NAC that was intending to be outward-facing. And I remember going to the first meeting and meeting Professor Rapishti, who was a scholar, a noted knowledge base on the region. I remember meeting multiple lawyers and multiple people who could write, knew the law, knew their way around the U.S. legal and justice system. A number of elder statesmen who had been around our community involved in traditional lobbying as well. And I said, it's still a bit of a ragtag group, and I will just be one more of the ragtag, but there's something to work with here. And if we can get ourselves aligned, we could really make something special out of this.
So what were some of the key challenges you faced when you were lobbying for Kosovo's independence? And how did you, as a group, overcome them?
So it's hard to answer that question because the list is so long. I mean, think about a startup group of people with big hearts, but no experience, no resources, no organization, no brand, no reputation. I mean, it's just, we had all the odds against us. And thankfully, we didn't. On that first night, I remember we we met, and there was a lot of conversation about all of these shortcomings that we had. And, I was young and brash at the time, and I remember specifically saying, so what are we going to leave this meeting achieving? And they were like, well, it's the first meeting that you're at, so what are you expecting? I said, I expect us to have an office opened. I want one of you to volunteer to be in that office. We need to come up with a first-year budget that actually is enough to get us through this period. I said, we got to start. I said, there's a crisis here. And that changed, and that sparked, everybody went to, yeah, why aren't we doing that? Let's move. Let's do.
You always need that one person.
And I was stupid enough to show up at this meeting with no alignment, So I was asking the question of hey, what are we here to do? Let's do it, whatever that is. And by the way, we're going to make mistakes. I know I don't know what I'm doing. I can speak English, but I don't know anything about foreign affairs or anything about Congress or anything. But I'm willing to stumble and take some risks and take some chances. And there are some great tales of that time in terms of what we were able to do and doors we were able to open. We had NAC members meeting with the President of the United States multiple times. We had
Bill Clinton at the time, right?
Bill Clinton. We had Secretary Albright, Sammy Eagleberger. There was, countless people in all the sort of key functions throughout government. We suddenly found ourselves able to get the hearing, and ours was mainly to advocate for what was obviously right, and the rest is history.
So really, it's like taking each step and just making sure, we know where we want to go. Don't get overwhelmed by the finish line. Let's just take one step at a time, and then one day you're going to be where you need to be.
I wish it was that obvious or programmatic. I would just tell you that we inspired something, and other people inspired us, because it was a bit of a back and forth. So people started seeing oh, wow, Albania's got a meeting at the Security Council. Oh, Department of Defense is meeting with Albanians from New York or Boston, or in some cases all of the above. Suddenly there's an action taken. And what that inspired is everybody in the community suddenly got lit up. I remember you couldn't find a newspaper in any city in the country that kids weren't writing to the editor saying, hey, you got your facts wrong about Kosovo. Here's what you need to know. Or letters weren't being issued by every one of those community groups that I said was inwardly focused. Suddenly they were outwardly focused. They had scholars. They had people with experience. They had stories to tell. They had trauma to share. And it suddenly, I remember when I met Senator Lieberman the first time, he said, where did you Albanians come from? He says, I never heard of an Albanian before, and now I can't stop hearing about you. You're everywhere. And we went from a group that was basically invisible among our communities all over the country to suddenly visible, because we were being heard on a matter that we had clarity of purpose. And even today, I feel like we're lacking a little bit in the community a voice as to what to do. There are things that can be done now. There are things that we should be advocating still. And if we had that unified voice today, I think we'd get some progress.
That's a good point, because that's what I wanted to ask you next. Where do you think we are today as far as the community? And I know that NEC closed down. We don't really have a lobby group that lobbies for us as a community. Do you think that we should maybe start looking into that again and try to form a more solid group or a lobby or whatever you want to call it?
Maybe a consistent group to continue?
Yeah, look, I would correct a few things. One is there is a lot of lobbying happening, more than people perhaps know about. But the lobbying of today is much more targeted. It is for specific things. Right. For example, I was one of the founders of the American University in Kosovo. And so as part of that exercise, we had a lobbying effort to try to actually get the American Schools and Hospitals Abroad program to actually become a partner to our efforts there. And we lobbied for that. I mean, it's very specific lobbying functions. We hired lobbying group to help us achieve some of those endeavors. We only had limited success, candidly, but despite that, I shouldn't say that, actually. Millions of dollars are still millions of dollars.
Yeah.
But,
I have a few cousins who graduated from AUK.
Yeah, so it's obviously that's another project that's near and dear to my heart. And I was on the board there for 15 years of my life, and very rewarding 15 years of my life. But the point I'm making is that there are all kinds of things that resemble lobbying today. I think what you're talking about is the kind of sort of leadership that you see on a grander scale, if you will, on a more integrated basis. And I think some of that, and I can make excuses here, but the reality is some of that is a byproduct of the division that exists politically in the region. I find, and when I focus on sort of Albania-centric issues, the highest issues are still back home. We're still unstable in the environments that we're in, and on a relative basis, we have challenges as a community here, and candidly, as communities everywhere in the world where we live too. There are challenges everywhere, but back home we still have relative instability. You have very early governments that are still trying to find their footing, and these transitions have taken a long time. Whether it's Albania from communism to a more market-based and more democratic principles society. Folks are still trying to figure out what that means. In fact, there's even trends going backwards and saying, hey, towards more dictatorial style tendencies. In Kosovo today, for example, you see a dynamic where Kosovo is being threatened every day. And so are there things that we as a diaspora could be doing on a concerted basis to change the tempo and message of our homeland? Definitely. I think, for example, for Kosovo, we could easily, as a unified voice around the country, as Albanians everywhere, reach out to our representatives and say, hey, it is unacceptable to us that you allow Serbia, who committed atrocities throughout the region, to continue to do it. We're not saying to you to go bomb them, but we're saying for you to, at a minimum, do things like cut off aid to Serbia indefinitely until they accept the premise that Kosovo is independent. It's a forever conclusion. There will never be another day that it's allowed to actually reverse any of those paradigms. That's number one. Number two is reward the good behavior. Kosovo actually deserves many, many different ways in which to stimulate economic development, opportunity set. There is no other country on earth, none, comparative to Kosovo or Albania, that loves America more, that would do almost anything and has done anything that America has asked of them, including things that hurt them. And we have been patient. We have been standing down, if you will, for a long time on issues that are holding us up and keeping us behind because of a bad actor. It's irrational to me that we spend months and years talking about license plates and when should a bridge be opened and what kind of behaviors are. No, run like a real country. Reward good behavior. Use the partnership. I mean, Kosovo today is increasingly becoming a young, vibrant, rapidly growing, IT-centric, youthful environment. Marry it. I mean, our Commerce Department, our I'll call it industry in this country, should be marrying it. That's a safe, comfortable place for any American to do business. There's nothing that would actually befall an American there.
I totally agree. I know because we're running out of time.
We're running out of time, but just to kind of like end today's session, looking back on your career and all of the work that you've done for the community, what are you most proud of and what do you still hope to achieve as your final thought for today?
That's a good question. I'm probably most proud of my kids. They continue to amaze me all the time. I mean, whenever I think I did something impressive or interesting, we debate all the time. Our house sounds like an arguing fest most of the time, but
I think that's just the way Albanians speak.
That could be. It could be. There are times when it's hard to digest, but I do see some things in them that are hard to ignore. They will say things like, in a debate about something, especially these days with all the political diatribes out there, you can imagine the discussions. But I may say something that says this, or this, and it's fact-based. It's very practical. It's reality, probably. And I remember my oldest daughter one day, in the midst of a discussion among many, on a particular issue, saying, just because you think it's practical, that's reasonable, that's a reasonable expectation, doesn't mean that's the right position. The right position in this particular instance, on this particular matter, is only what's right. And it needs to break down every door of practicality. It cannot be acceptable that anybody says on this issue that we need to be burdened by the fallibilities of mankind. We need to get to that ideal in our thinking in order to work towards it, instead of accepting the status quo.
Right.
And I remember just thinking, like, at first it sounded nuts. But I woke up the next morning and I remember hugging her and saying, that was the bravest thing I've ever heard anybody say, like on these kinds of issues. And I remember just being struck by it. I didn't know what to say in response. Because sometimes I sound like I know it all on some of these issues, but I didn't have anything to say. And I kind of thought about it overnight. And I just remember telling her the next day that how brave that was. I said, the ability to think about the impossible being possible is how we were able to spark this thing called NAC and saying, let's try.
Right.
Yeah.
And she reminded me in some ways about my younger self, where it was just like, yeah, I mean, of course, it's possible. So why aren't we already working on it? Because
Right, so
it's a foregone conclusion.
What she's
We will
telling you
succeed.
now is
Yeah.
what you've done in the past.
Yeah, but in much bigger context. And you know, even my younger daughter, you know, her steadfastness sometimes, which is remarkably frustrating at times, is also sometimes a source of, like, can you imagine this person in a position of leadership where, you know, all of the forces of the world may tell this person that you need to stop, you need to, you know, concede, you need to compromise, you need to do all these things. Can you imagine a leader like her in that mindset saying, this is right. I will not concede. I will not cooperate. I will not compromise. I will not give on what's right. What's right is right. And I see in both of them this moral compass, which I know comes heavily from my wife, that is so admirable. And they give me hope. And it's not just them. It's also their friends and kids of their age group. And a lot of folks these days pick on them as the social media generation that doesn't do anything or whatever have you. But I think they're going to surprise us, because I do think they're growing up different. I do think they are quite different than prior generations, and maybe the values or the disciplines of prior generations aren't as omnipresent today. But I actually think that deep in them is also some other fabric that was not so omnipresent in our generation that will actually matter more.
Yeah.
And so I could be wrong. I suspect I'm right.
They're going to be future politicians.
Who knows? I mean, you know, look, in the theme of what we've been talking about, everything is possible.
That's true.
But I think you got to love it, you got to want it, and the politics of today is not an easy sport.
Pretty
Indeed.
harsh.
Yeah.
Well, Richard, thank you.
Thank
It
you
was
so
a pleasure
much.
having you and listening to your story. I definitely want to have you back to talk about more specific topics, because I feel like this was only about, in general, we talk about you and your story. You have so much to tell people, and I appreciate you being here with us and sharing your story. So thank you. Thank you for being here.
Thank
I was
you,
delighted
Richard.
to be here. Thank you. And
And,
thanks for hosting me. And I wish you and your program great success. I think this is also an early beginning for you guys.
Yes,
and,
it
Yes, it is.
better days ahead. And I suspect this is the beginning of something wonderful.